Welcome to Designing Injury Prevention Programs that Athletes and Coaches Embrace. Injury prevention has been a well-defined field for decades, but until recently, I think we've been asking the wrong question. In this presentation, we'll explore a new way of thinking about designing injury prevention programs that will hopefully leave you feeling empowered to design programs athletes and coaches embrace. Before we dive in, I'd like to share a little bit more about me and how I got interested in injury prevention. So, like many folks who pursue careers in sports medicine and rehabilitation, I was an athlete. But I was a little different from other athletes because I was born missing my left leg, which allowed me to compete as an adaptive athlete. During my career, I broke a couple of American records for swimmers missing an arm or a leg. And while training for swimming, I fell in love with strength training. My love of strength training led me to wanting to better understand the science behind it and to share how powerful it is for injury prevention with others. So fast forward about a dozen years, and now I'm on a mission to bridge the gap between injury prevention research and practice, which is exactly the goal in this talk. We'll start with a background on injury prevention, what it is and whether it works. Then we will get into what gets in the way of injury prevention, the challenges, and then the facilitators, or what helps injury prevention take hold. And we'll finish with how to create injury prevention programs that athletes and coaches actually embrace through collaboration. So my overall goal here is to empower you after this presentation with the tools that you need to design and implement injury prevention programs that real-world athletes and coaches want to and will do. Starting with the background, injury prevention is the term that we use to refer to various strategies designed to reduce risk, severity, and recurrence of injuries in sports. And injuries are rarely caused by just one thing. They're usually the result of a combination of many factors. For that reason, injury prevention should also be multifactorial. So this can include things like warm-up and exercise, as well as athlete monitoring and load management, strategies for enhancing recovery, psychologically based interventions, and environmental control, which is things like taping and bracing and shoe wear, other equipment, rule changes as well. This talk will focus on the warm-up and exercise portion of injury prevention, so you can see the components of a warm-up that could be included. If you are interested in these other dimensions of injury prevention, I also have another recorded YouTube video that goes into more detail on each of those, so it's available at that QR code. The most quintessential example, I would say, of an injury prevention program, to give you a sense of what this looks like, is the 11 Plus, which was designed for soccer players by the International Federation of Association Football. So this is a structured dynamic warm-up that intends to improve soccer players' strength, balance, and jumping and landing mechanics and abilities. It was first introduced in 2004, and it has been improved upon over the last 20 or so years. And its goal was to fight the high injury rates that we were seeing in soccer. This is a worldwide phenomenon, so there are injury prevention programs for all sorts of sports across the world. So here are two more examples that can both come from Australia for Australian football or footy, and Australian well, not Australian, but netball, which happens to be popular in Australia. We have a lot of high-level evidence that shows that injury prevention programs work. They greatly reduce athletes' risk of injury, often in the neighborhood of 30 to 50%, or sometimes even more reduction in injuries. For example, we have 6 systematic reviews and meta-analyses here that I'll pull up on the screen that all support the effectiveness of injury prevention programs for reducing a wide range of injuries across a wide range of athletic populations. Yet, what we see is that injury rates have hardly changed over the last 30 years. These plots show injury rates for high school and college sports, each across 15-year periods, and you can see that they're pretty much flatlined through those time periods. So the question is, if injury prevention programs work, why have injury rates not decreased? And the short answer to that question is because athletes aren't doing them. But we can describe this in more detail with 4 nested domains. So the first domain is reach. And this is the question of whether the right people know about the programs. Are they well known and available? And then the next domain would be a subset of the people who it's reaching. These would be the people who are adopting or initiating the program. Then we have the people who are implementing it. So they're adhering to the program and they're complying with it. And finally, we have the people who are maintaining the program in the long term. So I have X's below each of these domains because really these programs are not reaching people, and therefore they are even being adopted at a lesser rate. And then, of course, implementation and maintenance fall from there. So we have research examples that illustrate this point. There was a nice study from 2020 of over 400 female student athletes. And of these respondents, only about 1 in 3 knew about ACL injury prevention programs, and then only about 1 in 7 had actually done one. So clearly, we need to do a better job getting the word out about injury prevention and getting people engaged with it, especially within the chaotic confines of real life. For a long time, we've asked the question, how do we get athletes to do these proven prevention programs? To me, this is the wrong question. The question that we should be asking is, how do we design injury prevention programs that athletes and coaches actually want to and will do? So instead of trying to retrofit the program to the athletes into their environment, like a square peg in a round hole, we should be designing it with the intended users in mind from the beginning. And there's actually a name for this paradigm, which is called implementation science. This is an entire field that is dedicated to translating research to practice. We can apply a lot of the lessons from implementation science to this injury problem. One of the concepts that comes from implementation science is the importance of the implementation context. So even when athletes and coaches know about injury prevention programs, they aren't widely adopting and adhering to them. And this is because the injury prevention programs aren't directly relevant to their context and to those stakeholders. So context refers to how people interact with their environment. It's the setting, culture, and infrastructure that injuries are happening in and that injury prevention programs are being delivered or should be delivered. So in terms of injury and injury prevention, context exists at multiple levels across a variety of stakeholders. So first, we have the athletes themselves. They're the ones who are performing the injury prevention program. And then in youth sports, their parents often come along as a package deal with the athletes. Athletes have their own set of beliefs and perceptions and attitudes about injuries and injury prevention. Outside the athletes, we have the team level. So at the team level, we have athletes' teammates. They support each other and exert various social pressures on one another. Then we have the sport coaches who are responsible for allocating time for the injury prevention program. They often sometimes deliver the injury prevention program as well. And then we have the sports medicine and sports performance teams who oversee designing the programs. And then the front office and administrators, they determine the policies, they allocate money and resources for prevention. And then the team as a whole has a particular culture and social structure around injury and injury prevention. Beyond the team, we have the league and society as a whole, which can also heavily influence beliefs, perceptions, and attitudes about injury and injury prevention. So all of this context really needs to be taken into consideration when we're designing injury prevention programs. We want to consider everyone's priorities and preferences and values, like including what's meaningful to each and every one of them. So, as I've mentioned, there's this mismatch between research showing that injury prevention programs work and the real world implementation of these programs. To unpack this mismatch, let's start with talking about some of the reasons that injury prevention programs aren't getting done. I've whittled this list down to a top 5, and it should come as no surprise to you that the number one barrier to injury prevention is time. So when we talk to athletes and coaches about this, they say that the injury prevention program is just too big of an ask. We're asking them to do too many sessions, too many times a week, and the sessions are too long. They feel like it's a waste of time and just a distraction from their training, especially when you consider that they already feel like they don't have enough time to train as is. So when you compare the importance to them of injury prevention versus the performance training that they have to do, they just feel like the opportunity cost is too great. They have other more important priorities. So all of this leads to the prevention program being deprioritized or not getting done. And also from the sports medicine and sports performance perspectives, there's a lack of time as well. So there's just not enough time to supervise these prevention programs when you're dealing with so many athletes, so many teams in each season. There's also, on the part of the athletes and coaches, skepticism and sometimes disinterest. So many times they're skeptical about the need for dedicated injury prevention, especially when we're talking about younger athletes who've never been injured before. Injury is just not at the top of their mind. Again, they might even feel like it's a distraction from the training they have to do because they're really focused on performance. If they are aware of and caring about their risk of injury, they still might be skeptical that the program will help them with that. They might be happy with what they're already doing with their status quo. They might say like, oh, we're already doing prevention exercises or similar exercises to what you're describing. So in general, there's this mismatch between the benefits that the athletes and coaches perceive that injury prevention will have for them and their priorities, all of which leads to a lack of buy-in on the athletes and coaches' part. They'll also say that having their resources are limited in terms of personnel, space, and equipment. So there just aren't qualified personnel with the expertise that they need to create and oversee these programs. Also, athletes and coaches might feel like they don't have the space to perform the program, and they might feel like they don't have the equipment that they need or that they think they need in order to perform an injury prevention program. Sometimes, too, the program is too difficult. So the exercises might be overly complex for them, or they might be too challenging, which makes it difficult for athletes or coaches to instruct themselves to perform them. And it makes them just difficult to do those exercises when they're not meeting them where they're at in terms of their current skill level. And finally, we have side effects and risks, or perceived side effects and risks. So athletes and coaches might be worried that the injury prevention exercises are going to cause them a lot of fatigue and make them really sore, and that fatigue and soreness is going to impair their subsequent performance. So if we zoom out, I'm sure that these barriers are not surprising. We're talking time and buy-in and limited resources, complexity and side effects. And yes, these are obstacles, but they're also signals that tell us where the friction is and where we can design things differently to actually make prevention happen. Let's shift gears then and talk about what actually helps facilitate injury prevention. I've whittled the factors down to 10 key ones, which I've grouped into 3 stages of injury prevention. So the first stage is buy-in, and then design and delivery. And I have one last facilitator that spans across all of the stages. So many of these facilitators might seem like common sense, but maybe the things that seem obvious are actually the hardest to do well. And we'll start with the facilitator that cuts across all of the stages, which is the collaborative process. So for an injury prevention program to work, we can't just come to the team and say, hey, listen to me, I have a PhD in this stuff. I've studied it extensively, and here's what you're going to do. That obviously won't work. So rather than assuming that sports medicine practitioners or sports performance practitioners know best, what we really need to do is take a grassroots approach and harness the expert knowledge that our stakeholders have. So if the injury prevention program can be tailored to address the specific needs of the athletes and team, that's going to get everyone on board and motivated from the beginning so that everybody has skin in the game. In terms of the stakeholders that we can involve in this process, we're talking about the athletes and sport coaches. So not only the sport coaches, but actually the athletes themselves. Maybe it's the team captains, and then the entire sports medicine staff, sports performance practitioners, administrators, parents in youth sports. We want everyone involved at every stage, from the design to the delivery to the evaluation and iteration. This is going to go a long way in combating many of the barriers that we just discussed. So we'll return to this idea of collaboration in more detail in the final section of the presentation on co-creation. Now we have the buy-in related factors. So the first of these is communication. There is actually research that shows that better communication is associated with lower injury rates. And some features of high quality communication would be things like presenting a clear and positive vision, as well as being respectful and encouraging and supportive, and recognizing when other people are making meaningful contributions, recognizing successes, and recognizing the hard work that everybody's putting in. The other thing that we want to do is avoid jargon. In other words, speak the other people's language. So avoid fancy sports medicine, sports performance talk that our athletes and coaches aren't going to be able to understand. So if we can speak their language and communicate strongly, this is going to go a long way in combating the skepticism and disinterest that we talked about before, and building that trust and buy-in that we need to get athletes and coaches adopting and adhering to our programs. The next buy-in related facilitator is providing education in a user-centered way about the rationale and benefits of the program. So again, this is going to counter that skepticism and disinterest. We need to emphasize what each stakeholder actually wants and provide education in terms of the benefits they care about, speaking their language in the process. So for athletes, this means focusing on how injury prevention programs are going to improve their performance. So we can tell athletes that injury prevention programs have been shown to increase their vertical jump, help them run faster, get them stronger, improve their balance, and so on. For coaches, we want to help them understand that if these injury prevention programs are going to make athletes more available to them, and that athlete availability will translate into wins. And there's awesome research out of college soccer that supports this very phenomenon. And then finally, for the rest of the sports medicine and sports performance team, we know that practitioners wear a lot of hats, and as a result, prevention can be deprioritized. But if we can do this upfront work to prevent injuries, or at least reduce the severity of the injuries that do inevitably happen, that's going to save us so much time and money on the back end rehabbing those athletes. The final buy-in facilitator is coming to a shared understanding among all the stakeholders. So we need everybody to be aware of what the injury problem is. We need them to understand how frequent and severe the different injuries that our teams are having. And we need them to come to an agreement on the need to address this problem with an injury prevention program. So again, this is going to combat that skepticism and disinterest, and it's going to increase the investment that everybody has in addressing the problem with an injury prevention program. Next up, we have our design-related facilitators. So the first of these is relevant to the sport and to the individuals. So we talk about this in terms of sport specificity. The injury prevention program is tailored to the sport, and that has to be crystal clear and so obvious that the athletes can easily see how it's going to carry over to their sport. One easy way to do that is to incorporate sporting equipment right into the program. So can you include drills where you're dribbling the soccer ball or dribbling the basketball or tossing around the football? The next relevance piece here is individualization, and this is going to be resources permitting. But in an ideal world, we can address each athlete's unique deficits. So that might be based on previous injuries that they've had. That might be on findings from a pre-participation exam. I recognize that that's not always it's not always realistic in every setting to conduct pre-participation examinations or to get a solid injury history. But if you can, and if you can individualize the program, at least to an extent in that way, then the athletes might be more motivated when they know the program is uniquely designed for them. If you're interested in learning more about the pre-participation exam or pre-participation screening, I have another recorded YouTube lecture that goes into way more detail on that. You can scan the QR code here. Next up, we have that the program is adaptable. So remember, one of the barriers that we talked about was the program being too complex or difficult or challenging. And then another was perceived side effects, athlete and coaches' concerns about fatigue, soreness, and impaired performance as a result of performing the program. So a good warm-up should actually enhance subsequent performance, not impair it. We want to stimulate the athletes without annihilating them. And we can accomplish this by making sure that the program is flexible and that we have multiple options for every exercise. So it meets the athletes where they're at in terms of their current skills and abilities. And then having those different levels also allows for built-in progressive overload. As the athlete gets competent in level 1, they can go to level 2 and then up to level 3. Finally, we want to make sure that the injury prevention program is fun. So again, this is going to combat that skepticism and disinterest if we can make it fun, if we can prevent boredom by including things like partner exercises and games and competition, and just making the program varied. So instead of doing the same thing for months on end, we might switch it up every month, or we might have a couple of different warm-ups that we alternate between. So that will hopefully combat that boredom. And I have some examples here, courtesy of Bridget from USA Squash. She's the head strength and conditioning coach. You can see that on the left, we have some tic-tac-toe relay races. Then we have some animal crawl variations, a bear crawl, a crab walk, and we also have a partner mirror shuffle on the right here. So these are fun. And they can help athletes to stay in the game and motivated to perform these programs. Then we have our delivery-related facilitators. And the first of which is that the program is simple and doesn't require a lot of resources. So we talked before about how limited resources like space, equipment, and time are barriers. Well, we can break these down by having the athletes perform the program right on the field or court, so they don't need any other space, and having the equipment be super minimal in terms of the equipment required, or maybe there's no equipment required and it's just body weight. So this makes the program really field expedient and helps break down those barriers in terms of resources. Then we have the seamless integration facilitator. So with this one, the program is being incorporated right into their normal routine. So they're doing it all together as a group, either before practice or after practice, or some of it before and some of it after as warm up and cool down. And we can figure out what the best time to do it is based on trying to minimize those side effects that they're worried about in terms of fatigue and soreness. So we don't necessarily want to place really fatiguing exercises in warm up because that will impair performance afterwards. So maybe, for example, instead of doing Nordic hamstring curls before practice, we do those after practice. And then the last thing is probably the most important, which is the time. So the prevention program has to be less than 15 minutes, or at most 15 minutes. If it's 20 minutes or 30 minutes, the athletes just aren't going to do it. The coach is just not going to adopt it. That's too long. And our third and final delivery facilitator is coach and athlete delivery. So we want the program to be simple enough that even a sport coach or team captain with minimal experience can lead the program. So of course, at first, that probably is going to require expert supervision on the part of a physical therapist, athletic trainer, strength and conditioning coach during the initial rollout. But over time, we can fade that back and just watch as the coach or athlete lead it. And then hopefully in time, we don't even have to be there. We can just come back periodically to check up, make sure that the athletes are still performing the program with high fidelity, That is to say that their quality and technique are still good, and we can just be there for those spot checks to reinforce. So here's a recap of those facilitators. These facilitators are all the ways that we can break down the barriers to promote adoption. So we have our buy-in factors. These are really interpersonal and attitude related, making sure that people believe in the program first and foremost. Then we have our design related features. These are about how we can thoughtfully customize the program to make it more compelling. And then our delivery features that make it feasible and sustainable for everybody involved: athletes, coaches, sports medicine, sports performance. And then across all of our stages, we are emphasizing that collaboration, because none of this works without that grassroots, bottoms-up collaboration. We can look back at the 11 plus now and see how it stacks up and related to each of these facilitators. So I've color-coded things: green for good, yellow for and red for lacking. So as far as our buy-in factors go, I've colored these all yellow because they're not really attributable so much to the 11 plus program, but more about how we talk about it. So that really depends. As far as the design goes, the relevance to the sport for soccer is certainly there. It's maybe a little bit less relevant if you're using it for other sports, though not completely irrelevant, just depends on the sport. But I've shaded it green to red because it's not individual specific. It's just a cookie cutter program that everyone would do the same thing, even though there are levels for each of the exercises. So it is adaptable for that reason. So for each exercise, they offer 3 options. That's a really good thing. And is it fun? I don't know. I think it's fun, but I love to exercise. Whether athletes think it's fun, I think, is debatable. As far as the delivery goes, it is very simple. It doesn't require hardly any resources except for a few cones. It is pretty seamless to integrate in terms of being able to do it before practice, before and after practice, right on the field or court. However, it is, if you do the whole thing, it's probably closer to 20 minutes than it is to 15 minutes. So I think it's probably a little too long. And I do think that it's simple enough, and they provide a manual that's easy enough to understand, that I do believe that an athlete or coach can lead the delivery if they've been trained to do so. So this is, and then as far as the collaborative process goes, that's not there because it's just a cookie cutter program that was created like, here, do this thing. But as far as this program goes, I think it's decent. Like, if you were to choose the 11 plus as your injury prevention program, I think that would be totally acceptable. But if your resources permit, and I recognize that that is a big if, I do think that we can do better. We can emphasize that collaborative piece from the beginning. So not the square peg in the round hole, not that we have this program, you do it, but coming together at the beginning and trying to figure out what works for everybody. I also think that if resources permit, we can make it more individualized. We can make it a few minutes shorter, and we can probably make it a little bit more fun in the ways that I showed before. Okay, so finally, we're ready to talk about the collaborative process. So at this point, we've discussed barriers that get in the way. We've discussed facilitators that make things successful. And now here's the crux. How do we co-create this program with our stakeholders? So after this section, I'm hoping you feel like you have the tools and resources that you need to design injury prevention programs and implement them that athletes and coaches will want to do and will actually do. So I've come up with a 7-step sequence that you can use to co-create an injury prevention program. And my intention here is to give you a roadmap that you can apply to any setting. So the first 3 factors or steps are buy-in related. The next 3 are design, or the next 2 are design and delivery related. And then we have the evaluation and iteration processes. So at each step, we're going to be leveraging our facilitators to break down the barriers to injury prevention. So we'll go through each of these one by one, starting with the buy-in steps. So the first step here is to assemble our team that we're going to collaborate with and co-create with. So this team should consist of all of the stakeholders we talked about before who are involved in the injury prevention program. So we're talking about the athletes and sport coaches, maybe parents, youth sports, athletic trainers, physical therapists, strength and conditioning coaches, physicians, administrators, and maybe there are even other members of your team that I left out. But the idea is that we're starting with this step, this collaborative, because we're going to be able to leverage that collaborative process facilitator that we talked about at the beginning. The next step is the injury audit. So here we're trying to describe the patterns and the impact of the injuries that we see with our sport and team. So we want to be thinking about what are the most common injuries in this sport? Which body parts, which types of injuries are we seeing? What are the mechanisms of those injuries? Where are they happening? Are they happening on the field or court? Are they happening in the weight room? What part of the season? Beginning of the season, end of the season, beginning of games, end of games? What impact are they having? How frequent are these injuries and how severe are they in terms of how many days that they're taking athletes out of the game? And we can answer these questions from a research standpoint by looking at sports epidemiology and etiology research on our specific sport, and then the age, sex, and level of play of our athletes. And we can also look at our own team data and answer these questions. And it's not just the expert practitioner trying to answer these questions. We're wanting to engage all of those stakeholders to ask them what they're seeing and to figure out if they are seeing the same things that we're seeing. Maybe that means providing some education so that we can reach that shared understanding of what the injury problem is and what the need is and how we can address it. The next step is to leverage our communication skills to learn from our stakeholders about the implementation context. So here are the sorts of questions that we can be asking. We can ask who the athletes are and who's going to deliver the program. Is it the athletic trainer, the sport coach, the strength and conditioning coach, a physical therapist, a team captain? What do the stakeholders want out of the injury prevention program? What are their goals? What are their desired outcomes? And what components do they want to be included in the program? When is this going to be delivered? Is it before practice? Is it after practice? Is it separate sessions? Where will it take place? Is it going to be on the field or court? Is it going to be in the weight room? Is it going to be in a hallway? What equipment is available? And how will resources be allocated in terms of time, money, whatever other resources are required? So, and then finally, how important is injury prevention to you? That's a really good question. So through these questions, we can get the information that we need to make sure that the program is relevant to the stakeholders and it's adaptable and it's fun for them. And that's also going to help us understand how we can set it up simply enough with the resources that they have available and integrate it into their routine seamlessly to help them deliver it independently. Next, we have our design and delivery phases. So for the design phase, this is where our expertise as practitioners comes into play. So we are going to leverage all of the facilitators we talked about before, making it relevant, seamless, simple, adaptable, and fun. And again, as I mentioned way earlier, these are the potential elements that we could include in our program, and here are some examples. This is all the detail I'm really going to go into for this stage here, but do feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about any of these elements or any of the examples. My contact info is at the end of this talk. Then we are ready to deliver the program after we've designed it. And here's where we as the experts are going to start off by attending the sessions and leading the sessions. And then we can fade that and transition to more of a supervisory role with the athletes, maybe the team captains or the coach delivering. And once they're proficient at it, then we just need to check in periodically and ensure that they're maintaining that fidelity, that their technique and the quality of the movement is still high. One helpful thing that we can do in this process is to provide some resources for them. So we could create an instructional manual that links to YouTube videos with each of the exercises. So even if we're not there, athlete or coach has a question about how the exercise is supposed to be performed, they can go to that resource and find that information. And then we can, of course, and should provide ongoing support. So checking in regularly to assess that fidelity and collecting compliance data from the coach. How many sessions a week? How many times a week are they doing this program? How's attendance on those sessions? At this point, then, we're ready to evaluate the program, see what our outcomes are, and gather feedback. So this should look familiar. We talked at the beginning about the reason injury rates having not decreased is because injury prevention programs don't have good reach and adoption, etc. And there's actually a name for this framework, which is called REAIM, which stands for Reach, Effectiveness, Adoption, Implementation, and Maintenance. So we can evaluate each of these for our specific situation. So did the program reach the people that we were trying to reach? Did they voluntarily adopt it and were they willing to initiate it? And then as far as implementation goes, did they actively participate in it? Did they comply with the dosage that we had prescribed, the number of sessions per week, the number of exercises per session, the timing that we agreed to, and the frequency that we agreed to? And then lastly, or second to last, the maintenance component, were they able to keep up with it in the long term? So all of these are actually just related to the program itself, even before we start thinking about our true outcomes. So when we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about the effectiveness of the program and the impact that it had. We can measure this in a lot of different ways. Success means different things to different stakeholders. So it certainly means how did we do in terms of reducing our injury numbers, but we can also cast a wider net than just injury numbers. So first, yes, injuries. How many injuries did we reduce maybe this season compared to the season before implementing it? How did our burden of injury compare in terms of the incidence of injuries that we were seeing, as well as the severity? Were there any adverse events, or negative side effects? For example, did the athletes feel like, or coaches feel like, the program was causing a lot of fatigue that was affecting their performance? And maybe do we need to find a more minimum effective dose in terms of frequency and volume so that we can keep the program adaptable and minimize those side effects? And then more than just injury reduction, the athletes are often very interested in performance, as we've talked about before. So we can monitor that. If we have preseason performance numbers, vertical jump, sprint, balance, strength, then we can measure those after the intervention, after the program has been done for 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, and see that our individual performance and team-wide performance has improved. Again, this is that user-centered education. Then we can think about what the resources and cost to us were. So we can look at the efficiency and the return on our investment. So there are certainly a lot of costs associated with this, right? Our time, our personnel, our space, our equipment, money, administration, athletic fatigue. So we want to compare that investment to the benefits that we received in terms of injury reduction and in terms of performance enhancement. And basically ask the question was that allocation of resources worth the benefits that we were seeing? And finally, we can ask the stakeholders what they felt about this. So what were the barriers and facilitators and areas of improvement for them? And here I have a bunch of ways that we can ask those questions. So what we're trying to do here is figure out how we can make the program even more successful in the future. So we're going to engage with our stakeholders once again and just see how it was for them, both physically, but as well psychologically, socially, and financially. So first of all, was the program understandable? Was it easy for them to follow? Did we succeed at speaking their language? Could they see the relevance in terms of the sport and the benefits? Could they see how it was sport specific? Were the benefits tangible to them? Was it appropriate? Was it matching the capacities, the abilities of the performers, or did they have to modify things in some way to make it easier? So sometimes modifications are necessary, but we don't want them changing it so much that it loses its fidelity. Then we have the suitability. So did it match their needs and preferences and values? We have acceptability. Was everyone willing to do it and do all of it? How feasible was it? Did it take the appropriate amount of time? Was it practical for them? Or what were the barriers that they encountered? And then we have sustainability. So in the long term, were they able to keep up with this over the course of the season? Do they think they could see themselves keeping up with it in the next season? And we can ask these questions in casual conversation, one-on-one, in small groups, or we could conduct surveys. So many ways to get at getting this information. So this process, again, it's about rinsing and repeating. Okay, we did it once. How did it go? How can we make it better the following year? And there's a neat example from the research where they took this iterative approach. It was a study from 2018 on professional rugby union. And they found that it actually took them 3 years until they got their injury numbers down. So a lot of trial and error. But when they did, they had the lowest injury incidence in their entire league and their best competition results. So the injury prevention program had the positive effects that everybody was looking for in terms of performance and in terms of injury reduction. And that's really the ticket. So with all this conversation about molding the program to the end users, you might be left wondering whether there's a chance that the injury prevention program actually becomes less effective as a result of taking everybody's perspectives into consideration. And the answer is yes. And you can imagine it's two examples here. One, a blue injury prevention program symbolized by the blue pill. Shout out to The Matrix, the movie. The blue pill injury prevention program has 100% efficacy. It's perfect, but only 10% of people are willing to adopt it. Then we have the red injury prevention program, which only half is only half as good, half as efficacious in terms of injury reduction as the blue pill, but 90% of our athletes are willing to adopt this program. So we want to think about what is the impact of each of these programs and which one should we use. So if you just do a simple back of the envelope calculation and multiply the efficacy times the adoption, then what we find is that the impact of the blue program is only 10%, whereas the impact of the red program is 45%. So even though our program is half as effective or half as efficacious, even though that efficacy is lower, if way more people are willing to adopt it, then that's going to have a greater impact. So the bottom line is that the best program is the one that the athletes will actually do. In conclusion here, we talked about all the barriers and the ways that injury prevention programs don't match the context and stakeholder values. So time, buy-in, resources, exercise difficulty, and side effects. If we can recognize these barriers to injury prevention programs, we can be more intentional about overcoming them. And the way we do that is by collaborating with our athletes and our coaches and the rest of our stakeholders. They're the ones who are the experts in their implementation contexts. So by co-creating these programs and aligning them with the user's priorities, preferences, and values, we can improve the practicality and relevance of the programs. And when we do this, this approach will maximize all of those domains of the RE-AIM framework: the reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and maintenance. And that's going to ultimately reduce the injuries that we're seeing. So bottom line here is that we design injury prevention programs that athletes and coaches embrace by creating them all together with the users, designing them to match their real-world context, and supporting them with systems that stick. So as you walk away from this, I want you to think about some small action steps that you could take. So, for example, think about what's one barrier that you could tackle more intentionally next season, or what's one facilitator that you could leverage that would have the biggest impact, and who's one stakeholder that you could involve next year who you haven't involved before. And finally, which part of the RE-AIM framework is currently your weakest link, and how could you strengthen it? I think that if we could just make one facilitator a little bit more central, or have one conversation with another stakeholder that is a little clearer, and make one program more fun or engaging, we would see amazing progress. Here are my references, and here are my objectives for this talk. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My contact info is here on the right. I'm pretty accessible through email and Instagram, so don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much for watching.